Welcome to week 1 of our course, Transmission of the Light. And during this first week, we're going to be exploring and studying the examples of Shakyamuni Buddha, Kashyapa, Mahakashyapa, and Venerable Ananda. So each week we'll have a look at 3 or 4 of the ancestors in Keizan's lineage, as they are described in his text Denkoroku, and translated into English. And so that means we won't be looking at all of the ancestors in the lineage, but certainly if there's one in particular that you really feel called to speak about, then by all means, feel free to bring that up. But right now I'm going to start with Shakyamuni Buddha. And the story that we have from the Soto Zen tradition about the Buddha and his enlightenment is a little bit different from what we find in other Buddhist traditions. And don't want to make so much of a comparison because, as I said before, I believe that our main task with this text is to really understand what sort of practice is being held up as exemplary, as one that we ourselves should be engaged in. And we can do that without comparing the Japanese understanding of this story of the Buddha or any of these people with other historical records that we have. Although once in a blue moon, I will bring up some of the history as it relates to these practices that are being suggested. So looking at the Cleary translation of the first chapter on Shakyamuni Buddha, it says that the Buddha realized enlightenment on seeing the morning star. And when he did, he said, I and all beings together attain enlightenment at once or at the same time. So what happens when you see a star? If you are seeing it, it's because the light from a star somewhere in the universe has crossed billions or maybe trillions of miles of space and has reached your eyeball. And that period of the light crossing, it took some amount of time. It came from a particular place. And we know from we believe from our current understanding, scientific understanding of the universe, that star might not even be there now because of the amount of time that it took for that light to arrive here at your eye. So in a very real physical sense, what has happened is that there is a connection between you and this object in the universe that transcends space and time. You couldn't actually travel there, but that light has traveled to reach you. And that star might not even be there anymore, but you are still impacted by it, in relationship to it. You are still, this body and mind is actually in a certain form in that moment that the light reaches you because of the historical presence of that sun or that heavenly object. So did the Buddha work all that out like that in his mind? No. he had a very, very embodied understanding of that. He had a visceral experience of that. The way in which our bodies and minds are our mere interaction with all the things that we contact and all the things that those things contact, and so on and so on. That we are ourselves a demonstration of the principles that are at work everywhere, universally. He had that experience. That's what it meant. And that's why he can say that I and all beings together awaken at this moment, at that time. For this reason, we also say that the Dhamma is timeless. It's not bounded by a particular culture, a particular moment. Even this moment of the Buddha's enlightenment does not put a boundary on awakening. So then the chapter goes on and it tells a little bit about the backstory of the Buddha. And it says that he sat so still that there were cobwebs in his eyebrows and a bird's nest on his head and reeds growing up through his sitting mat. That he sat so still for such a long time that nature was incorporating itself into him, into his space. So this kind of practice, this kind of diligence, this kind of persistence is the first exhortation that we see Keizan give us. And then he mentions that the Buddha transmitted his enlightenment to Kashyapa. We'll hear about that in the next chapter, so I'm not going to go much into that aspect of it. But then again, this next paragraph, fourth paragraph on the first page of the Clear Translation, says the behavior of Shakyamuni Buddha during his lifetime is a model for his disciples left behind, including us. We are his disciples. He kept the form of an old mendicant, no different from anyone else. It's very, very interesting. It's approaching the Buddha from the standpoint of his humanity, and the fact of his humanity being an inspiration to us, a support for us, a proof that we as well can practice this way, can realize what he realized, which is, by the way, consistent with what he said. And Keizan here refers to the genuine, the imitation, and the derelict, or let me see what the Cook translation of that word is. If I remember, he said that he used the word corrupt. Right, the Buddha's appearance in the world throughout the 3 times of the true Dharma, so the first 500 years of the time of the Buddha's teaching, from the point of the Buddha's enlightenment, 400 or 500 years is said to be the period of the true Dharma. And then there's a following period called the counterfeit Dharma, and the counterfeit period of the counterfeit Dharma period is characterized by the teaching of the Dharma is available and the practice is, but nobody understands it. It's not actually being fulfilled in any way. So it looks like the real thing, but it's not, because it's not based in actual lived received wisdom. And then Mappo is what it's called in Japanese, the age of Mappo. And we live, and Keizan also lived in the age of Mappo, the so-called collapsed is the translation that Cook gives us here, or derelict is what Cleary used, period of the Dhamma. So it's a time when even the teaching of the Dhamma has become corrupt or has become useless in some way. And yet, what Keizan is doing is he's using this cultural understanding of the times that we're in, hard times to practice Dhamma, so to speak, and says that nonetheless, the Buddha, his teachings, his him as a representation of awakening itself, the highest human capacity realized, completely fulfilled, is present throughout the three times. People can conduct themselves like that. People can do as the Buddha did, or Cleary translates this phrase very interestingly, says, in all their doings, folks who followed the Buddha's example have always considered the task of self-understanding foremost. Very, very important. The task of understanding what is one's own body and mind. So going back to the Cleary translation for a moment here, and finishing. So if we come to page 2, the second full paragraph, it says, Keizan says, this I, this pronoun I in the quote at the beginning of the chapter, is not Shakyamuni Buddha. Even Shakyamuni Buddha comes from this I. So now he's using this Zen way of speaking metaphorically. So what is the I from which Shakyamuni Buddha arises? It is awakening itself. It is the union of the absolute and the specific, expressing nirvana, expressing the completion of all things within nirvana and within the mundane samsara. This is the Zen understanding, that there can be no separation between the absolute and the relative, that the relative is an expression of the absolute and vice versa, that there, as we say at that the fifth of the 5 ranks, there is no point in even talking about two. So this I from which Shakyamuni Buddha springs, it's not a personal I. So again, returning to the Cleary translation, all beings on earth also come from here. All of the relative world, right in the midst of the perfection, right in the midst of that which goes beyond the relative, right in the midst of awakening. Don't think of Shakyamuni Buddha as having become enlightened, he says. And then going down a little further, he says, if you say you become enlightened with the Buddha, or you say that the Buddha becomes enlightened with you, this is not the Buddha's enlightenment at all. Why? Because the Buddha's enlightenment does not admit any separation. Not one, not two. That's how we describe it. In the next line, in fact, he says that, even so, I and together are neither one nor two. This is a very important concept. this neither one nor two. And is pointing specifically at interdependence, which is usually referred to in Buddhism, often referred to shorthand as non-self. Complete interdependence. This thing cannot be without all the other things that are at a given moment. Thich Nhat Hanh used to poetically say that the flower is made of everything non-flower. Therefore, looking more or less at the middle of page 2 of the Cleary, you are Buddha's eye. Buddha is your whole body. So while the seasons come and go at the top of page 3, mountains and rivers and land change with the times, you should know that this is the Buddha. This is the beautiful creative activity of the principles of reality awake to themselves. You should know that this is the Buddha raising his eyebrows and blinking his eyes. One branch stands out on the old apricot tree. That's the Buddha, historical Buddha. Thorns come forth at the same time. So you could say all of the specifics of the Buddha's life and the things that he went through as a teacher, even after his enlightenment. And we can look at this poem at another from another angle, perhaps, and say one branch stands out on the old apricot tree. That apricot tree is the cosmos. And one particular aspect of those principles that run the cosmos becomes apparent. But thorns come forth at the same time, right? The good and the bad of samsara, the reality of subjective life